One October day of 1999 in Horry County, South Carolina, a woman named Regina McKnight was being placed under arrest and stuffed into a police car. Shocked and confused, she tried to make sense of what was happening. She barely registered what the police had even placed her under arrest for. What was it they said? Homicide by child abuse? It had only been 5 months since Regina had gone into labor at 8.5 months in Conway Hospital. She spent much of the pregnancy preparing for the baby, even choosing the name Mercedes for her. However, there would only be devastation that day, because Regina gave birth to a stillborn baby. She begged the hospital staff to allow her to hold the baby, to take photos and bring an article of clothing home with her. But while she was grieving this huge loss, the staff of Conway Hospital was hard at work. You see, in the fall of 1989, MUSC, which stands for the Medical University of South Carolina, introduced a new policy called M7. M7 was established specifically to test pregnant patients for cocaine use. The policy was a direct response to the crack epidemic that began in the 1980s. At first, it looked like a first step towards rehabilitation, a way to ensure women using crack got the prenatal care and counseling that they needed. Now, on the surface, that sounds helpful, right? Sounds like healthcare. But what this policy actually did soon after it was created was much more sinister. Because as a public university hospital, MUSC functioned as a state institution, allowing for direct collaboration between medical staff and law enforcement to facilitate the prosecution of patients. And because the facility provided state-funded prenatal care, M7 primarily affected impoverished women who relied on public health services. And let me just mention the fact that while cocaine use occurred across all demographics, the M7 program's implementation in public clinics led to the disproportionate targeting and arrest of Black mothers during the crack epidemic. So, in the shaping of this policy, a whole team of different actors, such as the University Hospitals Council, the Charleston PD, and even CPS, gathered to devise a checklist for M7. Consisting of 9 suspicious traits to justify drug testing pregnant women without their knowledge, let alone consent. The hospital staff all over the state literally became trained to take urine samples in the event of a problem, death, or even the slightest bit of suspicion. And so, a trip to the doctor was no longer about medical treatment for some. For some, it became unconsented drug testing in order to receive help or prenatal care, with the unknowing threat of prison time looming in the background. If you were pregnant and didn't follow their specific path of treatment, the hospital called the DA. Doctors became informants and patients suspects, all under the guise of help. Of course, we see variations of this happening in the present day, with abortion and prenatal care, or lack thereof. By the time of Regina's case in October of 1999, though, M7 was for the most part suspended. The actions of this program had been deemed unconstitutional in 1994. I felt it important to explain the events of this timeline because it's important in understanding the vibes of the institutions and also for what comes next. So, there were no more sneaky, unconsented urine samples to be sent away for the purpose of prosecution. But as we will soon see, the state had long since found a different route. Anyway, Regina was pretty much forced into consent because signing these papers felt like a necessary step to receive medical treatment. But behind this form still lie the hidden weight of a prison sentence. And yes, they did find cocaine in her system, but life isn't so black and white, is it? Around 1 year earlier in 1998, Regina's world had been violently uprooted when her mother was killed in a hit-and-run accident. Regina was navigating homelessness, untreated syphilis, a serious thyroid condition, and very soon after, pregnancy, all while living with an intellectual disability. Yes, she was disabled. In her pain, isolation, and feelings of utter hopelessness, she began self-medicating with the super easy-to-find and unfortunately cheap crack cocaine. When you have lowered cognitive ability and your only protector is gone, I think it's safe to say that the world becomes a very dangerous place. Whether she was taken advantage of, sexually assaulted, or simply lost in the fog of grief, it seems crystal clear that Regina was self-medicating just to survive. So tell me, how informed could this woman really have been? Here is a 22-year-old suffering from extreme trauma and cognitive disability, sitting in a hospital bed, mourning the loss of her baby. She likely thought that signature was for post-pregnancy care, not an invitation for the hospital to turn her body into an episode of CSI. And because she supposedly consented to the urinalysis, when it tested positive for cocaine, the results were sent to the state, and the prosecutor began building a case using this other route I spoke of earlier. 5 months after she held her daughter for the last time, the police arrived to arrest her and take her to the Horry County Detention Center. Regina would face 19 agonizing months in a jail cell awaiting her fate, just sitting, very possibly not understanding why she was still there with no court dates in sight for the trial. When she finally entered that courtroom in May 2001, the shit show began. You see, the law is supposed to be a search for truth and fairness, but Regina's defense was empty and second-rate. Her attorney failed to bring up her intellectual disability and to present evidence that the STD or her thyroid condition could have caused the infection in the umbilical cord, which is what led to the stillbirth. They didn't even fight the idea that cocaine was the only possible cause of the stillbirth, which is what was presented by the prosecutor. Regina was found guilty of homicide by child abuse by a jury in a matter of 20 to 30 minutes. The sentence handed down was 20 years. She would spend 8 years behind bars, nearly a decade of her life, poof, gone, before the South Carolina Supreme Court was finally forced to admit the truth, that her trial had been a sham, with heavy usage of junk science to score her conviction. One example being that crack cocaine was unique in the way that it harmed a fetus. The true hypocrisy, however, lies in the comparison. Medical data shows that nicotine and tobacco can be just as, if not more, damaging to a developing fetus than cocaine. Yet, the state didn't charge women with homicide for smoking a pack of cigarettes, or men, for that matter, for increasing the possibility of damaging DNA integrity and sperm health by drinking or participating in drug use at all. They sure didn't demonize the substances being sucked up the nostrils of those living in white suburbs. They chose instead to weaponize a narrative around crack, specifically to pathologize and imprison Black mothers. Regina's conviction was overturned, but she was exhausted. To finally end the nightmare and avoid the risk of another trial, she eventually pleaded to a lesser charge for time served, just so she could walk free after 8 years had already been served. But how could a grieving, disabled woman be charged with murder for a medical tragedy? I know, it unfortunately doesn't sound so shocking given what we see in the present day after the overturn of Roe v. Wade. But still, this case is what started the ball rolling for the argument of fetal personhood that would continue for decades to come. And it also highlights the scapegoating of Black mothers during that time. Anyway, the state's other route that I spoke of earlier is this. So, testing women without their consent purely for the purpose of prosecution had been judged to be a violation of rights, especially after it was revealed that 29 of the 30 women arrested under this program were of color, even though rates of crack cocaine use was pretty even over demographics. However, a different avenue for this purpose came about due to a landmark case called Whitner versus State. In 1992, a woman named Cornelia Whitner gave birth to a healthy baby who tested positive for cocaine thanks to the allowance of unconsented urinalysis under Policy M7. Unlike Regina McKnight, Cornelia's baby lived. But still, the state charged Cornelia with criminal child neglect. She pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Cornelia later challenged her conviction in 1993, arguing that the state law defined a child as a person under 18, not a fetus. But the Supreme Court fought her case tooth and nail, and in 1997, they instead chose to physically rewrite the interpretation of the existing law instead of just admitting they'd been wrong. And so, it was ruled that the word person in the state's child abuse laws included a viable fetus. This ruling changed everything. It meant that a uterus was now like a legal residence, and anything a woman did while pregnant could be scrutinized as potential child abuse. It also meant that the state became like a guardian, basically. It could now bypass the need for secret hospital policies because they had redefined the fetus as a victim, with its very own set of independent rights. So this was the legal structure that we are seeing echoes of today, in different ways. This legal precedent is what allowed the state to turn Regina's stillbirth in 1999 into a homicide charge in 2001, because the law now viewed her fetus as a person, and her addiction was treated basically as a murder weapon. South Carolina had set the stage for the criminalization of women's bodies. But to understand why the state was so hungry for these cases in the first place, we have to look back at the era that, excuse the pun, but birthed this obsession, and so much that would come after. The Reagan administration and the war on drugs. Content warning. This episode contains discussions about drugs, fetal personhood, stillbirth, and a brief mention of suicide. Use discretion when listening. We here at Great in the Sack want you to stop doom scrolling, go outside, and make something meaningful of your day. Have y'all ever heard of the domino theory? Well, during that fateful period of time known as the Cold War, the United States operated under the belief that if one country fell to communism, neighboring countries would follow, like a row of falling dominoes. This idea shaped decades of American foreign policy. It framed communism as evil, but also as a spreading threat that had to be contained at all costs. To understand why anti-communism matters to this episode about the crack baby myth, we need to go back to the early 1980s. In January of 1981, Reagan took office as President of the United States of America. The country was already operating under the War on Drugs campaign, a term first introduced during the Nixon administration in the early 1970s. However, under the Reagan administration, the concept expanded significantly. He would take this idea and supercharge it. In 1982, Reagan formally declared illicit drugs as a threat to U.S. national security. His administration increased federal funding a ton and distributed said funding amongst 37 different federal agencies for the purpose of drug-centered law enforcement, shifting the emphasis instead toward policing, prosecution, and incarceration. Between 1981 and 1985, federal anti-drug spending rose sharply, with a growing percentage directed toward crime and punishment, rather than treatment or prevention. Public messaging reinforced this shift. In 1983, First Lady Nancy Reagan launched the Just Say No campaign by sitting on the lap of TV tough guy Mr. T. It was kind of weird if anyone listening remembers this. Mr. T's aspect of doing his part for this campaign was to make commercials for it, yelling at the viewers about kids doing drugs, and yeah, it's as weird as it sounds. The whole idea, it was so overrepresented, as though telling kids some abstract bullshit line like just say no is going to help them understand the nuances of what the fuck that even meant. Anyway, this national anti-drug initiative focused on abstinence messaging, particularly aimed at youth. I was only like 3, but clearly I still remember the remnants of this, due to how weird and abstractly unclear the ads were in the late 80s and early 90s. The campaign became one of the most visible symbols of the administration's approach. Now, throughout this period, drug use was increasingly framed in moral terms, as we so often see with this type of administration, as matters of personal responsibility and criminal behavior rather than the public health issue that it actually was. Legislative changes followed this structure too. The mid-1980s saw the passage of stricter federal drug laws, including mandatory minimum sentencing provisions that would increase incarceration rates like crazy. While this anti-drug initiative was unfolding, the administration was simultaneously heavily engaged in foreign policy efforts shaped by anti-communist priorities, particularly in Central America, and even a little bit in the Middle East, that had been going on for a good while. But before we get into that, we're going to talk a little about cocaine. By the early 1980s, cocaine trafficking into the United States had been increasing for several years. Powder cocaine had already become associated with wealth and nightlife and high-profile use during the late 70s. Think Studio 54 if you're old enough to know what I mean here. Crack cocaine was discovered kind of independently by various people in the late 70s and early 80s in the Caribbean and New York City as a way to turn cocaine into something smokable and even more addictive. Also, FYI, the name crack comes from the crackling sound that it makes when it's being cooked up. Also, slang like cook or let them cook is slang that comes from the act of making crack. It's produced by processing cocaine hydrochloride with baking soda and water, then heating it to form small, solid rocks that can be smoked. Because it could be sold in small quantities at lower prices, it became accessible at a much lower cost per dose than powder cocaine. Law enforcement officials and journalists began reporting significant crack activity in cities such as Los Angeles, New York, and Miami by the mid-1980s. The drug's rapid onset and short duration contributed to repeated use patterns. Its distribution model, small but cheap units sold at the street level, allowed it to spread quickly in economically marginalized neighborhoods. During this period, street-level gang dynamics also started to shift. Groups such as the Crips and the Bloods, which had formed in LA in the late 1960s and early 70s, some of whom were children of members of the Black Panther Party, became increasingly involved in drug distribution networks. So while their origins were rooted in local neighborhood organization and identity, the introduction of a highly profitable street drug altered incentives and priorities. It also introduced much more violent types of territorial disputes and violence in general. At the same time, federal sentencing laws would later establish dramatically harsher penalties for crack cocaine use than for powder cocaine use, despite the substances being pharmacologically almost the same. This disparity would have disproportionate effects on low-income and predominantly Black communities, which we will dig deeper into later on in the episode. So by the mid-1980s, crack cocaine was widely described as a national crisis, but the communities affected most weren't given the resources to address this crisis. It is important to note that the intensification of this war on drugs occurred alongside, and in some cases slightly before, the widespread public recognition of the crack epidemic. This overlap has led historians and analysts to debate the extent to which policy escalation was reactive, proactive, or politically strategic. Okay, so we got Reagan, his war on drugs, the introduction of massive amounts of cocaine into the U.S., and crack. Now back in time to the foreign policy part of the timeline. Many years before crack began to spread domestically, U.S. foreign policy positioned itself in ways that would intersect with drug trafficking patterns in the Western Hemisphere. Ways that sound so conspiratorial, I feel like wearing a tinfoil hat. And this is where we get back into the domino theory I spoke of earlier. In 1979, the Sandinista National Liberation Front, the FSLN, overthrew the Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua, which had reigned as a kleptocratic right-wing family dynasty since 1936. So yeah, let me give you a tiny backstory here, you know me. You see, the Somoza regime had been using Nicaragua as their own private fiefdom, accumulating billions by exploiting the country's resources. And guess who was in on it? Why, U.S. investors and multinationalists like United Fruit. It's even deeper than that, though. The regime was loudly backed by the U.S. Hell, FDR was quoted as saying, "Somoza may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch," referring to Anastasio Somoza Garcia Sr. The Marines facilitated the rise of the Somozas in the early 30s and onward, and their National Guard was even trained and funded by the good old US of A. And that's not all. During the Cold War, the US saw the Somozas as a reliable anti-communist barrier, which scored them unyielding US support, despite horrid human rights violations. So anyway, the Sandinista Liberation Front overthrew the Somoza regime because basically Nicaragua was tired of starving. The Sandinista government aligned itself with socialist principles and established relationships with countries such as Cuba, who shared their political beliefs, amongst other things, as you do in this situation, I mean, right? But the US was like, not in my backyard, get off my lawn. Within the broader aspects of the Cold War, U.S. policymakers viewed pretty much any leftist governments, especially those in Central America, as potential strategic threats. Thanks to the since-proved wrong domino theory, it continued to shape paranoid U.S. foreign policy. Because, I mean, if Nicaragua stays communist, El Salvador falls, then Mexico falls, then Texas is at risk. And because the Reagan administration viewed the Sandinistas through the lens of the domino theory, they began secretly using the CIA to train the Contras, who were these poor-performing right-wing militias, to overthrow them, the Sandinistas. The CIA provided the Contras with what they called the Freedom Fighters Manual, which literally taught them how to sabotage infrastructure. They also sent millions in covert aid. CIA planes were flying into Yopango Air Base in El Salvador and also in the Honduras daily. We, as in the United States, provided them with guns and intelligence, and also maps, the coordinates for Sandinista targets, and radio equipment, the whole 9 yards. And wouldn't you know it, many members of the Contras just happened to be previous members of the Somoza's National Guard. Now, because the Contras weren't a formal army, they had to be thrifty. And this is where drug traffickers became like day-to-day logistics partners. Because, after all, the Contras were a ragtag group that needed millions of dollars for weapons and food. CIA officers on the ground in Honduras and Costa Rica saw that their Contra contacts were working with known traffickers to move shipments north to the U.S. in exchange for cash and guns. The CIA realized pretty quick that if they followed standard law enforcement rules, they'd have to arrest their own, quote-unquote, soldiers. To keep the war going, they needed a way to keep this information out of the hands of police and the DEA. The CIA then used known drug smugglers' planes to fly humanitarian aid like boots and bandages down, knowing those planes wouldn't return empty. And because the CIA knew the trafficking was happening, they proactively went to the Department of Justice to create a loophole. And this was done by arguing that reporting drug crimes by their assets would compromise national security and quite possibly reveal secret methods. Attorney General William French Smith agreed to a specific clause that exempted the CIA from having to report drug trafficking by quote-unquote non-employees, aka the Contras. The CIA hired private companies to fly humanitarian aid down to the Contras. And these same pilots were often caught returning to the United States with empty cargo holds that smelled a hell of a lot like cocaine, or even with bags of cash. Internal CIA memos from 1982 show that the agency was well aware of which hangars in El Salvador and Costa Rica were being used to swap aid for powder. By 1982, Congress recognized that the Reagan administration was aggressively funding a foreign war with zero oversight. So after that shit started heating up, Congress dropped the First Boland Amendment, which basically said, hey, stop funding these wannabe terrorists to overthrow the Nicaraguan government. But just as that law passed, the CIA and DOJ finished signing their little loophole agreement, which was actually called the Memo of Understanding. In early 1984, it was discovered that the CIA had directly supervised the placement of underwater mines in Nicaragua's Corinto harbor. These mines damaged several merchant ships, including a Soviet tanker and a British vessel. The CIA had literally directed an act of war without notifying the congressional intelligence committees. Now, the first Boland Amendment was like a warning shot. And the second Boland Amendment, yes, there were two, well, that shut the whole show down. Because now that the CIA had proven that they couldn't be trusted even with limited support, Congress felt pressed to pass the second Boland Amendment in October 1984. This version was much more restrictive. It prohibited any U.S. agency involved in intelligence activities from spending any funds to support, directly or indirectly, military or paramilitary operations in Nicaragua. It effectively cut off all legal help to the Contras. This was a moment of desperation for the CIA. The CIA and also the NSC, the National Security Council, which included one of the most hardcore anti-communists that has ever lived second to Hoover, named Oliver North, started looking for private donors. They also started looking the other way even harder as their Contra allies ramped up the cocaine shipments to self-fund their war. And the CIA couldn't use taxpayer money anymore, so they relied even more on that secret agreement that said they didn't have to report drug crimes. This is when Oliver North became really involved in the good fight, and the National Security Council, the NSC, took over. Because the NSC wasn't technically an intelligence agency, which meant that the CIA could argue the Boland Amendment didn't apply to them. By the way, around this time, Reagan was so high off his bullshit anti-communist crusade, like so many figures in US politics before him, that he actually called these militias the moral equivalent of our founding fathers. Okay, so now it's 1985, and the DEA is trying to do exactly what the Reagan administration was publicly claiming to be its top priority, fighting this war on drugs. The DEA sets its sights on Carlos Albert Amador, a pilot secretly flying for the Southern Front Contras, who they discover is also transporting massive shipments of cocaine through Costa Rica and straight into Miami. The DEA traces Amador's smuggling operations right back to Yapango Air Base in El Salvador, specifically to Hangar 4. Ready to do their jobs, the DEA begins coordinating with local police to shut down this massive drug artery and arrest the smugglers. But plot twist, Hangar 4 is controlled by Oliver North. It is crucial to his covert Contra supply network operated by individuals deeply tied to the CIA and the right-wing Contra movement. When the DEA asks for clearance to bust the operation, the CIA gives them a big nope. CIA headquarters sent a direct cable instructing the DEA to back off. They straight up demanded that the DEA make no further inquiries about Hangar 4, blatantly lying to their own law enforcement agency by stating something to the effect of, "Only legitimate supported operations were conducted from this facility." DEA agents operating in the region, such as Celerino Castillo III, who began probing Hangar Number 4, were explicitly told by superiors not to interfere with the Yapango operations. Former DEA head John Lawn even testified that Oliver North may have deliberately leaked a separate DEA undercover operation, jeopardizing agents' lives just to gain a political advantage for Contra funding. Damn, Oliver, why you so obsessed with them? So let's recap here. While the government was fighting this war on drugs, Oliver North and the CIA were acting kind of as a protective shield for the cartel supply line. They viewed the influx of cocaine as an acceptable tax to fund their secret war against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. To stop communism, they were willing to actively sabotage their own DEA agents, block criminal investigations, and ensure that the very drugs destroying American neighborhoods continued to flow across the border, completely uninterrupted. But while the U.S. justified funding drug-smuggling right-wing militias because they claimed it was the only way to stop Soviet communism from spreading in the America's backyard, they'd also been quite busy in the Middle East, where they used the same exact excuse. To keep the Soviets out of Iran, the Reagan administration decided that they had to secretly sell advanced missiles to the very same hostile regime that was kidnapping Americans and actively threatening U.S. allies. They were willing to break every law, whether that meant cocaine smugglers in Central America or terrorists in Lebanon, as long as it kept the Soviets at bay, I guess. It's kind of batshit if you think about it. To really understand why the U.S. was secretly dealing with Iran in the 1980s, we have to go back and look at how they lost control of the country in the first place. Just a mini side quest here. I promise I'm not going to go off on too much of a tangent for this part. Okay, so for decades, the U.S. government had a highly profitable arrangement in the Middle East. Following the 1953 Iranian coup d'etat, a U.S. regime change operation that followed Iran's attempt to nationalize its own oil industry, the U.S. states propped up Iran's monarch, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The Shah was highly beneficial to U.S. interests, and to keep him in power, the U.S. became the largest seller of arms to his regime. They basically used the Shah as a heavily armed proxy to maintain control in the region, But in 1979, the Iranian Revolution swept the country, overthrowing the Shah and completely upending the U.S. power structure. The new Islamic Republic, which then came under control by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, inherited the vast majority of the U.S.-made weapons that the Shah had purchased. Ouch. Khomeini was fiercely anti-American, famously calling the U.S. the Great Satan. And in November 1979, Iranian students stormed the U.S. embassy in Tehran and took 66 Americans hostage. Also, Ayatollah Khomeini openly declared his goal of exporting his Islamic revolution to overthrow other governments in the region, like Iraq, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, which made him a massive immediate threat to U.S. interests. In response, the U.S. officially cut them off with a strict arms embargo. And here we go again with the "we must prevent the spread of communism" excuse again. Because by 1980, Iran was locked in a brutal war with Iraq and desperately needed spare parts to maintain its arsenal of U.S. weapons. Behind closed doors, the Reagan administration was panicking. A secret 1981 national security study concluded that the arms embargo was actually dangerous because it opened the door for Iran to fall into the Soviet sphere of influence. The logic was this: if the U.S. wouldn't sell Iran the weapons they desperately needed, surely the Kremlin would. Nice guys that they were and all. In 1985, National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane drafted a memo explicitly stating that the Soviet Union was perfectly positioned to exploit Iran's internal instability and, oh no, the spread of communism. McFarlane argued in this memo that the U.S. must step in and provide military equipment, quote, so as to reduce the attractiveness of Soviet assistance, end quote. So anyway, by 1985, the Reagan administration had two massive headaches. First, Congress had passed both Boland Amendments, making it completely illegal for the U.S. government to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. Second, Iranian-backed Hezbollah terrorists were holding 7 American hostages in Lebanon, and President Reagan was consumed with getting them back. Because, oh, by the way, following the Iranian Revolution, the Iranian regime sought to expand its influence across the Middle East by providing funding and training to the emerging militant group Hezbollah in Lebanon. This partnership had turned Lebanon into a sort of flashpoint for even more anti-American sentiment, culminating in a string of kidnappings, which is how those 7 Americans became hostages. President Reagan was, of course, playing the ultimate tough guy. He launched Operation Staunch, a massive diplomatic campaign that demanded that no country in the world sell weapons to Iran, officially designating them a state sponsor of terrorism. He also publicly and repeatedly promised the American people that the United States would never negotiate with terrorists. But, alas, deep in the basement of the White House, the NSC's own Oliver North came up with a scheme so wild it sounds like I'm making it up. Because the CIA and the Department of Defense were legally banned from funding the Contras at this point, North and the NSC decided to bypass the law by setting up a covert, privatized shadow network called the Enterprise. Take those tinfoil hats off, y'all. I promise this really happened. Here is how the heist worked. Behind closed doors, the Reagan administration decided to secretly sell thousands of advanced anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles directly to Iran in exchange for the release of the American hostages. But Oliver North added a brilliant, highly illegal twist: the markup. North and his arms brokers then sold the missiles to Iran at a massive multi-million-dollar markup. They took those secret off-the-books profits and funneled them into hidden Swiss bank accounts. That untraceable money was then used to buy weapons and supplies for who other than the Contras. The government was literally running an international arms smuggling ring to fund the very same Contra network that was allowing cocaine to flood into American cities. To try and smooth over the arms for hostages negotiations, U.S. officials even flew to Tehran in May 1986, bringing a Reagan-signed Bible and a cake baked in the shape of a key as, some kind of joke offering? Now, while the CIA was also protecting its Contra assets, those very assets were selling massive amounts of cocaine to distributors in the U.S. Two Nicaraguan traffickers, Danilo Brandon and Juan Norwin Meneses, were key Contra fundraisers. They began supplying massive quantities of cheap cocaine to Freeway Ricky Ross in south-central LA. As we spoke about earlier, crack had already been a thing. It is a common myth that Ricky Ross invented crack, but that isn't really accurate. But while he may not have invented the product, he sure did perfect the business model. Because his suppliers were linked to the CIA-backed Contras, Ross had access to unlimited cheap cocaine. He was able to mass-produce crack and sell it at a price no one could beat. While LA is the most famous ground zero for crack due to the CIA connection, it also appeared almost simultaneously in Miami and New York in the early 80s. Crack officially exploded in LA around 1984, the same exact year the Second Boland Amendment was passed. The government's need for off-the-books war funding perfectly coincided with the birth of the crack epidemic. Now, in order to understand why crack took such a devastating hold in black inner-city neighborhoods, we have to look at the systemic conditions that existed right before its arrival. This is a bit of a refresher from the Black Panther episode. So from the post-World War II era to the 1960s, a massive demographic shift occurred as people of color migrated to cities where residential discrimination forced them into crowded neighborhoods with an almost complete lack of services. By the 1970s and into the 80s, these areas suffered a severe economic collapse due to the departure of low-skilled industrial jobs and the middle-class flight, also called the white flight, which left behind a high concentration of extreme poverty. When crack arrived in these neighborhoods, it acted as a sudden influx of an illicit type of venture capital. The drug was cheap to manufacture and highly profitable. While affluent users were paying $200 or more for a gram of cocaine, crack could be sold just for $5 or $10 a hit, making it easily accessible to impoverished populations. The sudden flood of millions of dollars into desperate neighborhoods sparked a violent gold rush. The explosion in the homicide rate, which doubled for black males aged 14 to 17 between 84 and 89, was not caused by the drug making people inherently homicidal, but by suppliers and gangs fighting over massive, unprecedented profits. The media quickly established two entirely different narratives for two chemically identical drugs. In the 1980s, cocaine was viewed as upscale, fashionable, and prestigious, a drug for wealthy white people who wore silver spoons literally around their neck to flaunt their use, basically, but also for easy access to the high. Crack, however, was framed as an impoverished black issue, despite the fact that behavioral neuroscientists note the majority of crack users were actually white. In 1985, pediatrician Dr. Ira Chasnoff published a study noting that a small number of pregnant patients using crack cocaine experienced higher rates of premature births, and in the study, he observed issues like convulsions and smaller infant size. Crucially, Chasnoff's study was very small and uncontrolled, failing to account for factors like poverty, poor nutrition, or exposure to alcohol and tobacco. Despite the limited scope, the media seized on these findings, completely distorting them to spark a national panic. By 1992, Dr. Chasnoff himself was dismayed by how the press weaponized his research, stating that the media's framing was, quote, sexy, which I guess he meant salacious, that it sold newspapers and deliberately, quote, perpetuated the us versus them idea. Legacy media outlets took this flawed reporting and actively manufactured the idea of an alien, subhuman race. Prominent commentators, like Charles Krauthammer, cited Douglas Besharov, this dude who coined the chilling term bio-underclass. Yeah, eugenics. To warn of a generation of physically and mentally damaged children whose biological inferiority is basically stamped at birth. Krauthammer compared these children to, quote, subhuman drones from the dystopian novel Brave New World. This guy was quoting things left and right. Wasn't he original at all? Anyway, he insisted that their lives would be characterized by probable deviance and permanent inferiority. Oh, it's so gross. Articles in Rolling Stone and other outlets claimed these babies were oblivious to affection and hated to be held, painting them as monstrous anomalies. In the fall of 1986, the media's manufactured hysteria over crack cocaine had reached insanity. Politicians, eager to use tough-on-crime rhetoric, used this panic to push through some of the most devastating legislation in American history, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. This is where the infamous 100-to-1 sentencing rule was officially implemented, and it also set the stage for the harsh punishments imposed on women with crack in their system while pregnant. The legislation created mandatory minimum sentences that treated 1 gram of crack cocaine as legally equivalent to 100 grams of powder cocaine. By the way, if you're wondering, as I was, how can they tell the difference between crack and cocaine in the blood? Well, when you smoke crack, there is an extra chemical that is emitted through, I guess, the burning of it and inhaling it, called AEME, and that shows up on a drug test, or at least a urinalysis. Just so you know, because I wondered the same thing. Though I think it's pretty safe to say that they didn't really need to use that, they just were horribly racist. So to put the maths into perspective, if a person was caught with just 50 grams of crack, which is roughly the weight of a fun-sized bag of potato chips, they received an automatic, mandatory 10-year prison sentence. To get that exact same 10-year sentence, a person caught with powder cocaine would need to be carrying 5,000 grams, pretty much a full suitcase of coke. At the lowest levels, possessing a mere 5 grams of crack was enough to trigger a mandatory 5-year sentence without the possibility of parole. This law was used as a very targeted weapon. Think about the economics. Who has the money to buy and distribute 100 ounces of powder cocaine? High-level, affluent wholesalers. Who is buying a fraction of an ounce of crack? Poor inner-city users and street-level dealers. The 100-to-1 disparity ensured that the full crushing weight of the federal government fell directly on black neighborhoods. By giving a low-level crack addict the exact same prison time as a wealthy cocaine kingpin, the criminal justice system kind of criminalized poverty and race. The results were devastating, and they were immediate. Following the passage of these incredibly stiff penalties, the black incarceration rate in America exploded, vastly outpacing the incarceration rates for white Americans. The government had successfully designed a legal loophole to lock up an entire generation of black Americans for using the exact same chemical substance that wealthy executives and affluent whites were snorting with relative impunity. Something that I've learned a lot about in school over the last few months is intersectionality. Intersectionality is a framework used to understand how different aspects of a person's identity, like race, gender, and social class, for example, interact with one another. Rather than looking at discrimination as a single line, it examines the cumulative effect of these identities. It explains how women of color, in particular, often face unique forms of oppression that aren't captured by looking at race and gender alone. And the way these individuals were targeted, not just because they were addicts, but specifically because they were poor, black, and female, is a perfect textbook example of how intersectionality works. As I said before, behavioral neuroscientists have pointed out that the majority of crack users were actually white. However, the media and the legal system surgically targeted black women. As an ACLU lawyer noted at the time, the intrusion was entirely race and class specific, pointing out that rich women were not being hauled into court for their drug use. Black women addicted to crack were stripped of their bodily autonomy, treated as the antithesis of traditional family values, and transformed into objects of public contempt. Studies by researchers like Dr. Claire Coles and Dr. Hallam Hurt, who conducted rigorous empirical research on fetal drug exposure, proved that all of this pseudoscience and racist rhetoric was completely unfounded. And guess what their findings showed? That cocaine is no more harmful to a fetus than nicotine use, poor nutrition, lack of prenatal care, or other conditions associated with extreme urban poverty. In fact, prenatal alcohol exposure was, and remains to this day, a far more serious and devastating problem. Fetal alcohol syndrome causes permanent, irreversible structural brain damage, leading to lifelong difficulties with memory, attention, and cognitive ability. Yet, despite alcohol and tobacco causing far more drastic physical deformities and lower birth weights, there was no media hysteria about liquor kids or cigarette babies, and no mothers were being thrown into jail for drinking while pregnant. And now to shift back to Reagan. His administration had managed to keep its covert Contra supply network somewhat hidden in the shadows. But on October 5th, 1986, the entire operation quite literally came crashing down. A cargo plane loaded with Soviet-made AK-47s and other weapons was flying a covert supply route over the jungles of Nicaragua, intending to drop supplies to the Contras. Instead, Sandinista forces spotted the aircraft and shot it right out of the sky. Kind of feels like poetic justice, doesn't it? While the crash was devastating, one man survived. An American from Wisconsin named Eugene Hasenfuss. Yeah, I know, it's funny. Nicaraguan authorities quickly captured him and realized exactly what they had on their hands. The Sandinista government paraded Hasenfuss on national television, where he publicly confessed that he was working for the CIA to drop weapons for the Contras. The televised admission was the smoking gun that the Reagan administration had dreaded. Suddenly, the U.S. government was scrambling to do damage control, with officials like Secretary of State George Shultz going before the press to desperately and falsely claim that the government had no idea who Hasenfuss was and that he must have been acting as a private citizen. But the dominoes had already started to fall, unlike in their little theory. Less than a month after Hasenfuss was shot out of the sky in Nicaragua, a Lebanese magazine called Ash-Shira published a bombshell report on November 3, 1986, exposing the other half of the enterprise, the secret U.S. missile sales to Iran. Within weeks, the public realized that not only was the U.S. illegally arming rebels in Central America, but they were also funding it by secretly selling weapons to a hostile regime in the Middle East. Panicking over this news, Oliver North and his secretary went on a frantic document shredding spree inside the White House, destroying so much evidence that they literally jammed the government shredder. His secretary even smuggled classified documents out of the building in her boots. By 1988, the undeniable proof of the government's complicity was finally put on the congressional record. Senator John Kerry, yep, that John Kerry, led a subcommittee investigation that explicitly concluded that the senior U.S. policymakers had created a privatized Contra network that attracted known drug traffickers, and that the U.S. government had, quote, turned a blind eye to repeated reports of cocaine smuggling. The Kerry report made it clear that officials viewed the illicit drug money as the perfect solution to fund their covert war. Yet, the man at the very top, well, he completely evaded accountability. When questioned about his authorization of these illegal operations, President Reagan frequently contradicted himself and repeatedly leaned on the defense of, "I don't recall," or "not to my recollection." Behind closed doors, Reagan was already exhibiting the early effects of Alzheimer's disease, and his cognitive decline was becoming so severe that some of his aides even secretly debated invoking the 25th Amendment to remove him from office. Whether it was genuine memory loss from his failing health, a highly convenient political shield, or both, Reagan's deteriorating memory allowed him to deny any criminal intent and effectively dodge impeachment. The government had officially admitted its shadow network was intertwined with drug traffickers, but the mainstream media barely made a sound about this. The full truth would be swept under the rug for another 8 years, waiting for a brave journalist to finally connect the CIA's corruption directly to the devastated black neighborhoods of LA. By August 1996, the crack epidemic had already decimated black communities, and the 100-to-1 sentencing laws had exploded the prison population. Then journalist Gary Webb at the San Jose Mercury News published a massive 3-part investigative series called Dark Alliance. Publishing it simultaneously in print and on the early internet, Webb finally connected the dots. He traced the pipeline directly from the CIA-backed Nicaraguan Contras to the crack flooding the streets of LA. It wasn't perfect, but he showed that the U.S. government had protected known drug traffickers because those traffickers were secretly funding their Contras. When the story went viral, especially through black radio stations and communities who finally had proof of what they had been suspecting for years, the CIA panicked. Again. But they didn't even have to fight Webb themselves. The legacy media did that for them. Humiliated that they had been scooped on a massive national story by a smaller regional paper, the LA Times, Washington Post, and even the New York Times formed a firing squad against Webb. The LA Times alone assigned 17 reporters to a Get Gary Webb team, vowing to take away his Pulitzer. They relentlessly picked apart minor flaws in Webb's reporting while completely ignoring the massive, undeniable truth at the core of his story. Webb was abandoned by his editors, driven out of journalism, and utterly disgraced. Tragically, the relentless hounding broke him, and on December 10, 2004, Gary Webb died by suicide. But history proved him right. While the media was busy destroying him, declassified National Security Council emails, the 1988 Kerry Committee report, and the 1998 Internal CIA Inspector General report all confirmed the underlying premise of his work. The government did know that the Contras were smuggling cocaine. The government did turn a blind eye. The CIA even had a secret 1982 agreement, remember that legally exempted their agents from having to report narcotics violations. Webb was ultimately vindicated, but it was far too late to save his life, or the lives of the millions affected. So we can really understand the hypocrisy of this error. We gotta look at how the story ends for the two different worlds. In Washington, D.C., the architects of this huge conspiracy, especially Oliver North, the man who illegally shredded documents and coordinated a global arms for hostages drug ring, became a right-wing hero with his own television show. President Reagan claimed he didn't recall and left office with sky-high approval ratings. Other key players received presidential pardons. But on the streets of America, an entirely different justice system was applied to an already vulnerable group of people. Decades of systemic racism and a lack of economic resources had already pushed inner-city Black communities to the edge. When crack hit, acting as a sudden influx of illicit capital, the government weaponized the crisis. Politicians and journalists created the myth of the crack baby and the monstrous crack-smoking mother, which I unfortunately remember very clearly growing up, with commentators like Charles Krauthammer falsely warning that Black women were giving birth to a bio-underclass of irredeemably damaged children, which he borrowed from someone else, by the way. The media claimed that these babies lacked the capacity for affection and were biologically inferior. Pure eugenics nonsense. And even though the majority of crack users were white, it was still Black mothers who were painted as villains. And this brings us right back to where we started. Regina McKnight. Because this manufactured hysteria, hospitals like the Medical University of South Carolina began secretly drug testing Black pregnant women and handing their medical records over to the police. The state hunted them. Women like Regina McKnight, grieving mothers who had suffered stillbirths, were thrown into jail and convicted of homicide, despite scientific evidence showing that existing medical conditions, poverty, lack of prenatal care, and/or poor nutrition were equally or more likely to blame for their pregnancy losses. The 100-to-1 sentencing disparity ensured that an entire generation of Black Americans was locked away, expanding the Black incarceration rate from roughly 600 per every 100,000 to nearly 1,900 per every 100,000. The ultimate tragedy of this error is that the United States government actively shielded the drug pipeline that flooded America's streets with cocaine, and then turned around and ruthlessly punished the most vulnerable victims of that epidemic just to justify a racist war on drugs. They built a massive prison state on the backs of Black mothers in Black neighborhoods, all to pay for a secret war that most American people never wanted. I can't say all. I tried to find a way to incorporate the welfare queen myth into all of this, but this episode had so much to tell, and frankly, I became a bit tired of Reagan after this. I think this is where the Witch Hunt series will end for now. Who knows what comes next? I hope you give the show a follow and find out. Also, you can find me through the links in the show notes. Next time.